Back in 1996, Mike Tyson was on top of the boxing world, just nearly unstoppable. But for years, there was one guy just really trying to get on that card, really trying to fight him. And of course, that guy was Evander Holyfield. And after trying for so many years, they finally worked it out. The fight was on. It's going to be a great one. The odds started out, Evander was about 25-1 odds behind, so he wasn't looking great. By the time the fight rolled around, it was about 5-1, so it was like, all right, people had a little faith in him. But fight's on, fight night. Evander comes out of the tunnel wearing just this beautiful purple robe. And on it, etched in big, bold, white letters, is one biblical passage. Philippians 4:13. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. It's a classic one from our second reading today. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. And if you were alive then, or if you know anything about boxing, you know that he won. 11th round, TKO, took out Mike Tyson. What a day. But then, up and down the ages, just every athlete and their grandma, apparently, every athlete and their grandma has stitched these words on their jersey. Or you put your black eye on, and then you put on Philippians 4:13. You get tattoos of it, Philippians 4:13. I can do all things in him who strengthens me. It's like this catch-all line for, hey, I'm about to go do something, but guess what? God's going to help me do it. No problemo. Easy peasy. It's one of those verses that we've just misquoted up and down the ages. It's kind of funny. It's silly interpretation too, because what happens? I always love to point out this example. What happens when both boxers come out with that on their robe? It's like, who's got to have to pick one, or it doesn't work. So it's clearly not what Paul's talking about. This misunderstanding. And I'm not going to tell an athlete, don't put that on your jersey, please. Great. But this isn't quite what Paul's getting at. This misunderstanding of Philippians 4:13, it comes from that mindset that we've been talking about for several weeks now. Just this modern progressive mindset. Because this vision of the world, this modern progressive vision, it doesn't really have any place for God. Not the God that we believe in or the way that God operates. In this modern progressive vision, when do things go bad? Things go bad when the circumstances are stacked against us. And we're the victim, right? Why'd you lose your job? They sent it to China. I'm the victim. Why'd you gain so much weight? They built McDonald's too close to my house. I'm a victim. It's not my fault. What do you want me to do? We're always the victim. Just go turn on the news real quick. Every bad thing happening anywhere. It's the circumstances. It's not our fault. We're the victim. But then you get to the other side of it. When do things go well? Well, things always go well because I did it. I picked up myself by my own bootstraps. I got off my butt. I grabbed the bull by the horns, and I started getting stuff done. Again, that's also all over just any news channel, any YouTube channel. They're going to tell you, hey, if you want your life to get better, you better start working a whole lot harder. And then this is where God comes in. And they'll quote Philippians 4:13. If you need the God angle too, well then 4:13, you can do all things in him who gives you strength. This is not the vision Paul had. Paul wasn't trying to talk about boxing or your job. Paul had a very specific vision of the world, and it wasn't this modern progressive one. So we have to, as we've been talking, we have to have this kind of meta news, this change of mind, this different way of seeing the world around us. And that's when everything Paul's saying becomes a lot more clear, but also that's when just our whole life and our mission in life becomes a whole lot more clear. This is going to sound a little random, but what do you think, Tom? What do you think Mark Twain's best book was, according to him? Some people will say Tom Sawyer. Some people will say, who's Mark Twain? Some people will say Huckleberry Finn. But according to Mark Twain, it was Joan of Arc. A lot of people don't even know that Mark Twain wrote a book about Saint Joan of Arc. But he did, and this is what Mark Twain said. I like Joan of Arc best of all my books, and it is the best. 12 years of preparation, 2 years of writing. The others needed no preparation and got none. So here's Mark Twain, this super genius that can just crank out a book anytime that he wants. Bestseller, boom, done. But when it came to this book about Joan of Arc, he spent 12 years just researching it. He read her original trial manuscripts. So this book is just very, very historically accurate, but it's also beautifully written because Mark Twain wrote it. So it's just a joy to read. I'd encourage you to go read it. At the beginning of this book, it starts out with Joan, who's just, at this time, just a 14 or 15-year-old girl. And it's almost like I'd have to say it again, but she's a 14 or 15-year-old girl in 15th century France. And she's dirt floor poor. She comes from a very rural, very unimportant town there in France. She can't read, can't write. But then all of a sudden, she starts hearing voices from God. And God's telling her, you're going to be the one to save your nation, and I'm going to help you. I know you're all good historians, but I'm not, so I had to look it up myself. In 15th century France, life was not going well for the French. Britain had just swept across their land and just run them over. It wasn't pretty. Like I didn't know this, but like France has apparently been very bad at fighting for a while now. It's a centuries-old problem, the French and their fighting abilities. Many members of the church's hierarchy were corrupt. The king was in exile, so he wasn't even trying. He was just kind of waved the white flag. The country had little hope, if any. And so the people, they were just trying to get by. Literally just trying to get by. So in this circumstance, these are the circumstances there in France in the 15th century. In these circumstances, this 14, 15-year-old girl starts hearing voices from God that she's going to be the one to save her nation. The crazy part of this is that she starts telling everybody. She starts telling everybody in her town, I've heard the voice of God, and he tells me I'm going to save the nation. And they tell her exactly what you'd expect them to tell her. Sure you did. Tell us more about this, Joan. Are you okay? Do you need some help? They're just like, lady, you're crazy. She starts telling people, I need to go see the governor so that he can send me to see the king so I can get this show on the road. Again, imagine, it's like some nice 14, 15-year-old girl, freshman, sophomore over at Lyons High School says, guess what? I need to go talk to Laura Kelly so that she can send me to talk to President Biden so I can fix all the problems in the country. We would look at her like, oh, okay, that's real nice. God told you this? Oh, okay. No, we'd be like, lady, you are crazy. And that's what they called her. Everyone thought she was nuts. But eventually, she's persistent. She eventually gets a meeting with the governor against all odds. Long story short, she finally gets a meeting with the governor. And he thinks she's crazy. But eventually, she convinces him. And he's like, you know what? Okay, here's a couple of men. Here's some horses. Good luck. Here's a letter for the king to go see. I doubt he'll do it. She goes to the castle where the king is in exile. Very predictable. He doesn't want to see her either. He's just like, this is dumb. I don't need to talk to this. She's about 17 now. I don't need to talk to this gal. Like, we have bigger problems. Eventually, just to kind of embarrass her, because she's being so persistent, and everyone in the town and even around the country, there's kind of this buzz growing about who's this 17-year-old girl that's apparently hearing voices from God that she's going to save the country. Eventually, they just let her in, but they're like, we'll just trick her. We'll just embarrass her. So they put a fake king on the throne. So she walks into the throne room, trumpets are blaring. She walks in right up to the king, and she goes, you're not the king. She'd never seen him before in her life, never seen a picture. You're not the king. Turns to somebody else in the crowd and is like, you're the king, and I'm here to help you. Like, people are just shocked by this. They're just really blown away by this young woman and what she's doing. And she eventually convinces the king. They put her on a fake trial, again, trying to embarrass her and trip her up. But eventually she convinces him that she's serious and that this is very real. And the king, to his credit, he's got some brass. He says, you 17-year-old girl that can't read or write, that probably just learned to ride a horse a couple of weeks ago, you are now in charge of the armies of France. You're now the general of the French army. This is very real. You can go Google this. I'm not making this up. This is historically accurate. This actually happened. And the first thing that Joan of Arc does as general of the army, she starts forcing all those soldiers to go to Mass twice a day. Like, all right, first things first, we're going to Mass twice a day. But then they just start tearing across the country and winning every single battle that they fight. She shouts out to the British. She talks to the British before these battles. She's like, we're on a mission from God. You should just leave. I don't want to have to hurt you today. And they're like, sure. And every time, just runs them over. And there's more to that story. But it's just crazy, all these sorts of things that are going on. I tell you this story with a little bit of a point. Some of you are teenagers. They might be checked out by now, though. You're not a teenager. You're not dirt floor poor. Like, you have electricity at your house. Like, you may be poor, but you're not as poor as Joan was. You can read and write. Your lives are not at risk. But the thing is, our country, but our lives, our culture, our world is in that same sort of shambles like France was there in the 15th century. And it's not in shambles because of the Democrats or the Republicans or this president or that or the economy or even like this terrible thing going on in Israel right now. That's not why the world is in shambles. Those are downstream of the problem. Like, I've been talking for several weeks, things are in shambles because we've set up our lives according to this vision, this certain vision of the world that we call a modern progressive vision. We live just by the fact that you were born in the United States, we live with this vision of the world. And even though things can appear to be progressing, even though you probably just got your iPhone 15, beautiful phone, even though things seem to be progressing, things are still in shambles. I don't need to quote all the stats again. In other words, the metaphor is that we find ourselves in a sort of battle. It's a very ancient metaphor that we find ourselves in this spiritual battle, this spiritual warfare. It's not the battle, though, that you're going to hear about. If you flip on the news, CNN, Fox News, whatever you watch, they're all going to tell you the battle is between Republicans and Democrats. The battle is between white and black, man and woman, immigrant citizen, Israel, Hamas. They'll tell you about all these other battles that are going on. But that's not the battle that's going on. That's not the battle that's truly going on underneath it all. We live in this time, right, where everything's amazing, but nobody's happy. We had a quinceañera yesterday, beautiful party, great time. But I was talking to one of the kids at the party, and I was just like, "How's your life?" And they go, "Life is so boring." I was like, "Okay, let me get this straight. You're at a party, great food, music, dancing, all your friends." It's like this person's a loner. All your friends are around, but life's boring. Okay. So everything's great, but nobody's happy. It's those stats that I've quoted. What's skyrocketing right now? Everyone's joy in life? No. Anxiety, depression, anger, hopelessness, just division, everything. Everything like that is skyrocketing. Because we've lived our lives according to this modern progressive vision, and it makes a lot of promises. It makes so many promises to us, but they're false promises. It can't follow through on it. We've been chasing those promises for a while. That promise that humans can reach perfection. We can enact perfect justice. We can bring peace to this world. We can bring joy. All these things, and it's a false promise. That's the battle we find ourselves in. So what did Joan do? In her time, in her battle, she was never despondent or pessimistic. She was faithful, and she knew that God would come through. What she did was so amazing. You just have to go read the book. I'm not going to spoil the whole book for you. But what she did, really what it boiled down to was three things. Joan was incredibly faithful to God, and just had great faith that he was going to follow through on his promises. Joan was also incredibly faithful to the teachings of the church, and Joan had incredible courage. And it can sound even just too simple to kind of boil it down to three things like that. And yet that is just, man, if you want a foundation layer for what you need right now, there you go. Right, to have incredible faith in God. And I've talked about that enough. I'm not going to bring up the wheelbarrow across Niagara Falls today. But it's about putting our lives into God's hands. Not just believing God exists, but to say, I'm going to actually place my life in his hands. I'm going to follow the teachings that he gives to us through his church. In a time where it's very easy for us to be like, can't we change that one? Or can't we get with the times on that one? We're like, I don't know. No, what if we were just faithful to what the church taught us? What God teaches us through his church. But then the third one, and this is the big one, what if we had the courage to actually live it? I say all this, you can ask it this way. I'll just kind of boil it down to this, and this ties it right back into Paul's letter. Is it easier or more difficult now to be a saint? Here in 2023 in Lions America, is it easier or more difficult to be a saint? I don't know. It's an open question for you. But as Paul would point out to us, and this is where this verse actually does make sense, I can do all things in him who gives me strength. Paul's circumstances weren't pretty. Paul wrote this letter in prison, remember? Paul's circumstances weren't pretty. But he knew that he could continue to follow Christ whatever the circumstances were. And he knew that God would give him the strength to do that. Right? We know the same thing, that we know that God will give us the strength to be faithful. He will give us the strength to be obedient to those teachings of the church, and he will give us the strength, that courage that we need to continue to follow. It takes very specific courage, though. Again, this courage is the key. It takes a very personal courage. Anybody discover how hard it is to pray every day? You wake up 3 days later and you're just like, I don't think I've prayed in 3 days. Okay, that's one thing. But have you ever discovered how hard it is to follow your faith and to live your faith when people are discouraging you from living your faith? And they're just like, you still believe that stuff? You still go to church? Come on, get with the times. And people will tell you that. They really will. So it takes a very personal courage to say, no, I'm going to continue to place my faith in God. I'm going to continue to live this. Even if people even if I'm the local lunatic here in Lyons, I'm going to continue to live my faith. It takes that personal courage, but it also takes a private courage. It's easy to post something on Facebook that says, I believe in God. It takes a whole different level of courage in private to sit down with somebody, for example, sit down with your spouse and say, hey, I think we need to change up some of the ways that we do things. Or I think we need to, try to live our lives more in accordance with the way that the church teaches us to live. That takes a lot of courage to have that kind of a conversation. It takes a lot of courage to sit down with your kids and say, hey, I know all your friends and all these other families do life one way, and they're going to call us crazy, but we're going to live a life where we place God first. And so life's going to look a little bit different for us. It takes a lot of courage to have that kind of a conversation. And then that's where a sort of public courage comes in, sure. Where, again, it's not just you posted something on Facebook. It's when people start noticing that you're the local lunatic. And they're like, why are you the way that you are? And you just continue to live it. Right? You have the courage to continue to live that witness. You know what Joan said? Joan of Arc. They asked her point blank, Joan, aren't you afraid? You're 17 and you think you're going to do this? Aren't you afraid? And she said this simply, I'm not afraid, for God is with me. I was born for this. Simple as that. Joan's courage, it didn't come from the fact that she watched a good YouTube video that told her she needed to take life by the horns. It came from the fact that she knew God was with her. The Lord's my shepherd, right? Psalm 23, there it is again. She knew that her life was in God's hands. That's where that courage came from. And she also then knew, right, she was born for this time. She knew that God made her not to be the victim of her circumstances. God made her for those circumstances. God intentionally placed her in that time, in that place. And she hung her hat on that. She knew that God would give her the strength. And she knew that this was the time, this was the place for which she was born in order to follow. Right? It takes courage for us to decide that we're not going to let ourselves be swept down the stream by that current that is the world and is our culture today. But instead to say, I'm going to take a paddle and I'm going to go upstream. It takes courage to say, I'm going to change the way that I think and I'm going to change the way that I see the world around me. It takes courage to place our faith and to make that daily commitment to place our faith in God and to follow the teachings that he gives us through his church. This is the sort of battle we find ourselves in. These are the circumstances that we're in. And yet, as St. Paul points out to us, what? I can do all things in him who strengthens me. Just like in the gospel today, we're invited to this banquet, and it's at this Eucharistic banquet that we are given the strength to continue to live this. And so we gratefully accept the Lord's invitation, but with great courage, we continue to follow.